Hi there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and I'd like to talk to you about something that's a little bit weird, an odd habit that we Magic players have that sometimes clouds our ability to evaluate cards correctly. That habit? Chasing red herrings. And no, I don't mean the card red herring, I mean cards and synergies that look enticing and make us feel very clever indeed, but which don't necessarily pan out the way that we want them to. By confronting that bad habit, hopefully we can learn how to break it and get a lot better at deck building, especially in those early stages with a newer deck where we're still experimenting with that deck's potential. So pull up a chair, feel free to do the YouTube things if you'd like to help out the channel, and let's get into it. As a launching point for this discussion, I'd like to share one of my new decks with you, take you on a quick tour of how it works and why I think it's a good example of this red herring phenomenon. And the leader of that deck is this guy. Winter, Cynical, Opportunist, the Golgari Precon commander from Duskmourn. A 4-mana 2/5 Death Touch, it mills on attack, and on your end step, Winter can consume a Delirium's worth of card types from your graveyard to bring one of them back with a Finality counter on it. This is the list I've been tinkering with, full of spells like Mulch and Grisly Salvage and all sorts of nonsense to help stack up that graveyard in the first place. And then of course a bunch of huge 7 and 8 drops that Winter will cheat into play on the end step. I've only had this deck for a short time, but I truly cannot get enough of it. It's some of the most fun I've had playing Magic this year. Obviously I have my biases, I obviously love Reanimator decks, and I also like commanders that give you little puzzles, and trying to find the right number of card types here is a great puzzle, as is the tension of continually emptying and trying to refill the graveyard. Honestly, I think people are sleeping on this commander. At the time of writing, of the 8 Precon commanders from the Duskmourn set, Winter's popularity is 7th place among them, and I totally understand why. Other decks like the Rakdos Punisher Precon are a really cool piece of work, and I get why something like Rendmaw would capture people's attention a little bit more, since caring about cards with 2 types feels like a more novel space to explore than more Golgari reanimation. Plus, Winter has a couple pesky drawbacks. You have to exile cards from your own yard, and you have that Finality counter situation, where bringing something back is basically a one-time deal. If the thing with the Finality counter on it would die, it's gone forever, so you can't reanimate it. Other reanimation decks, like Marin or Muldrotha, don't have that kind of problem. They aren't one-timing anything, they can always get it back. So yeah, Winter's got drawbacks, but allow me to make my case here. Winter is able to resurrect not just creatures, but also cool artifacts and enchantments. And you don't need to build up no experience counters or pay a bunch of extra mana to do it. Mill yourself a little on turn 2 or 3, drop Winter on turn 3 or 4, and suddenly you've got yourself an early Sandworm Convergence or an early Wondrous Crucible. You're cheating out Eldrazi Conscription, which technically has 2 card types. Even sillier cards with multiple types like Greater Tanuki or Eyeblight's Ending can fulfill basic functions like your ramp and your removal, and then become exile fodder to help more quickly bring out a free, say, Akroma's Memorial. And all the while, other payoffs like Amzu reward you for removing such an expensive card from the yard, or things like the World Spell help dig for even more awesome stuff to cheat into play. It's fun to tinker with even more card types like Planeswalkers and Battles too. Reviving a free board wipe has really saved my bacon here and there. Plus, I don't know if you've gotten the chance to play Polluted Cistern yet, but that card is messed up. I played a game with it literally last night where it helped me deal 14 damage in a single turn just from all of my effects that helped me fill the graveyard. Quick shout out to some of my other finishers too. Demolisher Spawn is dead easy to trigger, and I used this other one in a Challenge the Stat segment a short time ago, but you look upon the Tarask is a very handy card to use on a commander that happens to have Death Touch, forcing everything to block it, dealing 1 Death Touch damage to all those blockers and wiping them all out while the rest of the team can get on through for tons of damage. Good luck coming back from attacks like that. And one last funky thing here, Winter can exile any number of cards from your graveyard as long as there are at least 4 card types among them. We all know that Sir Conrad is Busto, but it's a really funny surprise to drop him into play and then on the end step, exile a bunch of stuff from your graveyard including all the creatures, just because you can and because of all the Conrad carnage it'll cause. This deck has been bonkers fun, but when I say people are sleeping on this commander, I totally understand why they are, because I myself was one of those people. I did not take Winter seriously until I played with it in an all precon pod, and that's when I was finally able to be like, oh, this is actually rad. But when I first read the commander and I saw that it requires self-exile and that it qualifies those resurrections by giving things finality counters, I met that text with skepticism rather than with excitement. I mentioned commanders like Marin earlier, which don't have to worry about exile exiling their own graveyard or only being able to get stuff back one time, I get why Winter can look timid by comparison. If anything, Winter brings cards like Gyrus to mind, which can also get things back from the graveyard, but only on that one-time basis. It doesn't sound as appealing to brew up something like that when we already have access to other reanimation that doesn't have those same compromises. So I totally get why Winter is not a first pick. But the thing I like about Winter is that reviving bonkers good enchantments and artifacts just one time is often kind of enough. It's not a particularly huge cost to exile a Delirium's worth of card types from the graveyard either, because let's be real, I wasn't reanimating my instants and sorceries anyway, so I don't mind losing them to get back an 8-drop of some kind. And once those baddies are in play, well, some of these cards are actually pretty hard for opponents to get rid of, and even if they do, by the time they're able to knock one of them out, Winter's already been able to summon another problem. These are lessons I've learned playing the deck, and it's been a fun experience, but this video isn't just about Winter being underrated. I wanted to share my list and some of those lessons to start things off, but this is actually my version of the deck after a couple of drafts. And what I actually want to unpack in this video is something I tinkered with in those earlier drafts of this deck, the red herrings I chased, and how easy they were to go after. My first versions of the deck contained a lot of cards like these: Hex Parasite, Thrall Parasite, Power Conduit, things that can remove counters. By removing those Finality counters, I'd be able to reanimate any of my cards that get removed, the way that Marins and Muldrothas can bring things back multiple times. And some of these effects, like Pharopede, even have multiple card types. What a boon for this Delirium deck. It seems like a match made in heaven, right? It sounds like a synergy that's too good to pass up. And yeah, those synergies are really cool. It sounds rad. Here's the problem though, the timing. For those counter-removing cards to work, for them to produce their intended effect, the following has to happen. 1, I have to fill my yard to get the right types to find something spicy to resurrect. 2, I have to cast Winter and keep it around so that it can in fact revive something impactful. 3, I must find and deploy one of those counter-removing cards to take that Finality counter off of the resurrected thing, and in some cases I may need to wait for Summoning Sickness to wear off to make that part happen. 4, whatever impactful thing that I resurrected then has to die or be destroyed. Not get exiled or whatever, but some type of removal must send it back to the graveyard. And 5, I then need to get Winter back out to do the thing again, and specifically want to revive that exact same target again, even though the battlefield may have changed a whole lot since that point. Those aren't all implausible, necessarily, but the key thing I'm trying to hone in on here is that those counter-removing cards are really only useful as a late-stage backup plan game item. They don't help facilitate parts 1 or 2, which are just fill the yard and cheat things into play, the primary game plan. Every bit of energy that I spend trying to prime one of my targets to be able to come back again in case it would die is energy that I could just spend making parts 1 and 2 happen over and over and over again, maybe with brand new targets. Or just, I don't know, protect those things from getting blown up at all, like using defensive spells that keep them from dying or from getting targeted in the first place. Protective spells that also have other applications, or which could protect even more things than just those targets. That synergy, removing Finality counters, sounds so awesome, but when I actually tinkered with them, those cards were so devoted to a contingency plan, so devoted to a plan B, that they kind of got in the way of me being even able to make plan A happen in the first place. They were cards that are kind of only good if something goes wrong. But dang, they sure sound clever, don't they? It sure felt good when I first put them into my early drafts of that deck. It flatters the ego to locate that type of cool synergy and to pull it off. But just because it feels really cool or it sounds really clever doesn't mean it's actually impactful when you're really in a game. And that's why I wanted to use my new Winter deck as an example to springboard into this bigger topic. That's why I'm calling it a red herring synergy. Now let me clarify real quick that I don't think this entire idea is a bad one. I still play nesting grounds in this deck, for instance. It's really neat to move Finality counters from my stuff onto something an opponent controls. That's funny as heck. But what's important there is that that effect is on a utility land, so it's not costing me a spell slot in the deck. And every so often, I still will consider some other cards that could make it into the 99, such as Glissa, cards that happen to be able to remove counters, but which also have other big impacts on the battlefield too, so that you're not devoting a whole card slot just to something that will remove a counter. Pursuing that effect too highly wound up with me just putting the cart before the horse. It sounded cool, and it is pretty cool, but it wasn't actually helping me out in game the way that I thought it would. And it certainly wasn't helping out as much as other big effects might, such as protecting my whole board or helping me draw more cards. But it was such an easy red herring to chase when building that deck because the synergy feels so dang clever. Winter's a big example of this phenomenon for me personally, but these types of red herrings are all over the place. Zephi is another fantastic example. Whenever you cast or copy spells, Zephi will scry. If the spell is medium-sized, you'll make 4/4s, and if the spell is 10 mana or more, Zephi does a huge blowout of damage. When this commander first came out, I saw lots of folks chasing after that 10 mana threshold. But when I played the Zephi precon and when I was tinkering around with some upgrades for it, I did not care about anything but that 5 mana threshold. Even just using the stock precon list, I spent 3 turns in a row making a minimum of 6 4/4s per turn just by copying or storming 5 mana spells. I did not need that 10 mana bonus. That 10 mana bonus reads as so much more exciting, but only getting that to happen once or twice wasn't nearly as impactful as filling the board with dozens upon dozens of elementals. I think chasing after that big stretch goal would have been a distraction from the other powerful potential that I was already tapping into. Or here's another, the Teamer Commander Flubs, who helps you draw cards on an empty hand, but forces you to discard cards otherwise. In early EDHREC data for Flubs, we saw a lot of Madness cards peppering the page, since Flubs would force you to discard and thus grant you the cheaper Madness cost to cast those spells. And while that sounds neat in theory, players who tried this synergy out quickly discovered that it's much more of a meme than a dream. Trying to line that up with exactly those cards in hand was tough, and more often than not, what happens is that you wind up with only having a single Madness card in your hand, which you're then forced to play at a higher cost, and Flubs' strategy really wants you to move way quicker than that would allow, so the Madness cards were actually a little bit of a dud. Once again, a red herring synergy. Cool in theory, but not in practice. Or take the card Inquisitor Eisenhorn. That top line of text about trying to create a specific token, that's all a whole lot of words, and I think ultimately it just distracts from the bottom ability, where whenever Eisenhorn hits a player, you make a ton of artifact tokens. Suit Eisenhorn up with some unblockability and some cranial plating effects and all that, and you've got yourself one heck of a rad Voltron deck, in colors that make it super easy to counterspell enemy interaction and slip commander damage through every single turn. I might have to build this deck, that sounds so cool to me. But that potential can be overshadowed, easy to miss if you get caught up in the red herring of that top line of text. Trying to trigger that top ability doesn't need to take up your time, and trying to make it happen just feels kind of forced and eats up valuable card slots that you could be using on another very cool direction instead. Or to bring it back to one of my own personal examples again, for a while my Wilhilt the Rockcleaver deck contained the cards Teferi's Veil and Death Tyrant. All of Wilhilt's Decayed Zombie tokens fall apart after one attack, so Death Tyrant sought to replace those zombies, which felt like a really neat idea. And Teferi's Veil phased my creatures out after combat, skirting around the death trigger so they'd be able to attack again next turn. The thing is, my Wilhilt deck can't wait for stuff to die. More death triggers equals more happiness as far as the zombies are concerned, so Teferi's Veil protecting the zombie tokens was almost a moot point. And as for playing a non-zombie creature in the deck like Death Tyrant, well, every time I got a card like Death Tyrant into play, there was always something else that kinda could have gone into that card slot, like a Raise the Palisade or a huge zombie buff effect, that would actually just help me take an opponent or two out of the game instead of trying to help me restock my zombies. These cards are cool synergies in the deck, but chasing those protective elements to keep my board intact ultimately felt like it was just distracting me from my actual game plan, which is of course to just let the zombies do zombie stuff. Commander is such a vast, sprawling format that we have like 800 things demanding our attention at all times while we're brewing. Chasing down even one synergy inevitably reveals yet more synergies. Bringing it back to the Winter example, there are even more aspects to this commander that I could continue chasing. I already tackled the Finality counters and how trying too much to mitigate those made me get in my own way, but also Winter has Death Touch. Are there even more lure or ping effects that I should run to try and capitalize on that Death Touch? And if I do, what do I cut to make room for them? Or Winter mills all on its own, so do I forgo the self-mill spells on the deck and then just go all in on Winter being the mill enabler and therefore make the deck more Voltron-y? Or since Winter reanimates artifacts and enchantments, do I have room for payoffs like Constellation triggers? And lots of stuff is entering and leaving the graveyard in this deck, do I lean into other Amzu-esque cards that will make tokens whenever things exit the graveyard? Any one of these sounds really cool. They feel like big brain plays, moments where we're leveling up because we're connecting dots and threads together in ways that make us feel more masterful at Magic the Gathering. And whenever we discover cool sounding synergies like that, our instinct is, of course, to embrace them. But trying to be too comprehensive, trying to cover every contingency and chase down all those potential synergies, can sometimes distract you from the actual important thing that makes your commander interesting or powerful in the first place. Building a deck means there are dozens of bits of stimuli all demanding your attention, tons upon tons of potential pathways to go down, but you have to decide how much to weigh every single one of those abilities, every single one of those options, how far down certain pathways you really want to go, and which pathways you have to ultimately decline. Because by trying to make room for one of them, you inevitably leave less room for another. And there are only 100 card slots, so space is limited. A cool synergy sounds cool, it feels good, but sometimes it's more parts clever than practical, so we gotta zoom out and we gotta be honest about our deck lists, and sometimes decks just need a more straightforward approach. We're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't ground our decks in reality. So how do we break this red herring habit? You may have heard before the deck building advice to give your commander deck an elevator pitch, a single short sentence that just describes real quick what it is you're trying to do. I like this advice a lot because it keeps you focused and honed in. Here would be my elevator pitch for winter. I mill myself to reanimate expensive permanents from my graveyard. Boom, done. That's just 10 words. If I couldn't sum it up like that, if I also tried to tack on things like, and also it's trying to mess with the counters to make my targets eligible to be reanimated multiple times, or I'm also trying to give my Death Touch commander ping effect so that it can pick creatures off and all of that extra stuff, that might be a sign of things becoming overcomplicated. Having an elevator pitch or a mission statement, a simple short phrase that reminds me why do I love this deck, helps me catch myself so that I don't end up spending a bunch of time or a bunch of money trying to do too much or spreading myself too thin, so that I don't end up chasing those red herring synergies. And navigating that for one commander helps me recognize the things that I'm interested in honing in on for other future commanders that I want to build too. So I hope this is useful for you and that it helps you stay focused with your own brews out there. Which red herring synergies have you spent too much time chasing down? What's your favorite deck's simple elevator pitch? Let me know in the comments below. Remember to hit the YouTube buttons if you like the channel and want to see more. And as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.